This video examines published sources for educational purposes. Interpretations are attributed, no claims are asserted as fact without citation. May 13th, 1943. The port of Oran, Algeria. Major Friedrich Radke adjusted his Afrika Korps goggles one final time as he watched American liberty ships stretching toward the horizon. The veteran of Rommel's desert campaigns, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, had just surrendered, along with 250,000 German and Italian soldiers, following the collapse of Axis forces in Tunisia. What happened next would challenge everything these hardened Wehrmacht veterans believed about their enemies and their cause. According to military historian Arnold Kramer's extensive research, the journey these prisoners were about to undertake would prove more devastating to Nazi ideology than any battlefield defeat, not through propaganda or coercion, but through the simple, overwhelming evidence of what American industrial democracy could achieve. Before we uncover today's secret from World War II, if you enjoy exploring the hidden stories and overlooked battles of history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more untold wartime histories. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always amazed that these memories of the past connect us across so many corners of the world. The 371,683 German prisoners who would eventually reach American shores between 1943 and 1946 expected to find a nation weakened by war, divided by racial tensions, and struggling to match German industrial efficiency. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a decadent democracy, incapable of sustained military production. These assumptions would crumble within hours of their arrival. Records from the office of the Provost Marshal General indicate that the first shock came during the Atlantic crossing itself. Unlike the cattle cars and freight wagons that had transported German troops across Europe, these prisoners found themselves aboard surplus Pullman passenger cars with upholstered seats and regular meal service. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Steuben, whose Prussian family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, noted in his diary that American guards seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort, apologizing when air conditioning malfunctioned, but nothing could have prepared them for their first glimpse of the American mainland. As documented by historian Charles Stenger, German prisoners arriving at Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia witnessed a port operation that handled more tonnage in a single day than Hamburg managed in an entire week. The base sprawled across 4,300 acres, its docks stretching for miles, cranes loading and unloading dozens of ships simultaneously with electric precision that moved smoothly and continuously without the coal smoke that choked German industrial cities. According to contemporary accounts, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. Obergefreiter Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before his conscription, counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of loading. Each crane lifted loads that would have required 12 men and horses in Germany. The parking lots filled with civilian automobiles belonging to dock workers particularly stunned the prisoners. In Nazi Germany, private automobile ownership remained a privilege of the wealthy and party elite, with fewer than 1,000 Volkswagens ever delivered to civilians despite promises dating to 1934. The train journey from Norfolk to prison camps in Texas and Oklahoma would prove even more devastating to Nazi preconceptions. As recorded in multiple prisoner diaries later discovered by researchers, the endless American countryside blazed with electric lights. Every farmhouse, every street corner, every shop window displayed an illumination that contradicted 3 years of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. Even before the war, rural electrification had reached barely 20% of German farms, while blackout regulations had plunged the Reich into darkness since 1940. Military records describe how German prisoners pressed their faces against train windows, witnessing an America that Nazi ideology claimed couldn't exist. Towns like Martinsville, Danville, and Greensboro displayed illuminated shop windows and electric signs that would have been luxury items in Germany. The trains passed factories running night shifts, their windows glowing, parking lots full even at midnight. One prisoner, whose father served as a Nazi party block leader in Hamburg, wrote that they passed through dozens of cities that first night, each with more electricity than all of Hamburg combined. Contemporary documentation reveals that the infrastructure itself became a classroom in American industrial capacity. At railway stops, prisoners observed automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, and mechanized lubrication systems that performed in 30 minutes what would have taken German workers 2 hours. Railway workers wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages, drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles they discarded half-finished, and smoked cigarettes continuously. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer from Siemens before the war, calculated that the single railway yard where they stopped used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire Berlin district consumed in a day. The casual waste appeared magnificent to men shaped by scarcity. Buildings remained lit when empty, electric fans ran in vacant rooms. As Müller documented, it was the carelessness of infinite resources. According to historian Stephen Ambrose's research, the journey through Tennessee and Kentucky exposed prisoners to American industrial power in full display. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched for 3 miles along the river, its electric furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the synthetic rubber plants of Rubbertown employed thousands of workers in facilities that had emerged from empty fields in just 18 months, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually, compared to Germany's maximum of 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from E.G. Farben, immediately understood the implications. In post-war interviews, he recalled recognizing the distillation columns and catalytic crackers, each facility more advanced than anything Germany had built. The realization that America possessed dozens of such installations across the country shattered his understanding of relative industrial capacity. Military historians note that the prisoners' exposure to American automotive production provided perhaps the most stunning revelation. Ford's Willow Run plant, visible from passing trains, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from 1,550,000 parts, manufactured by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant consumed 2.5 million square feet of floor space and used more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Hauptmann Werner, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window as they passed, counting 17 B-24s in various stages of completion. German propaganda had insisted American aircraft were inferior and hastily built, yet he could observe the precision of assembly lines and quality of construction. These were not inferior aircraft, but superior ones built faster than German military science considered possible. As documented in prisoner correspondence that survived censorship, the deeper American trains penetrated into the heartland, the more complete became the destruction of Nazi mythology. In St. Louis, crossing the Mississippi River, prisoners witnessed barges carrying more grain than Germany's entire 1942 harvest. Grain elevators stretched along both banks, each holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote that Americans transported food as Germans transported ammunition, in endless quantities, without concern for loss. The livestock operations proved equally overwhelming. In Kansas City, massive stockyards held tens of thousands of cattle awaiting slaughter, the smell of meatpacking plants filling the air for miles. German prisoners who had subsisted on 200 grams of meat per week, when lucky, watched American workers eating beef sandwiches during lunch breaks. One prisoner noted they ate meat like Germans wished they could eat bread. Contemporary accounts describe how American abundance extended beyond military production to civilian comfort that defied German comprehension. The prison camps themselves, built in just 4 months, housed between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners in conditions that exceeded what most had known as civilians. Wooden barracks featured electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. Each building constructed with more lumber than entire German villages possessed. According to medical personnel among the prisoners, the camp hospitals astounded them with facilities better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility with X-ray machines, surgical equipment, and pharmaceutical supplies that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941. They possessed penicillin, this miracle drug that Germans had only heard rumors about, used freely, even on prisoners with minor infections, while German soldiers died for want of basic sulfur drugs. The daily rations challenged everything prisoners understood about wartime scarcity. Kitchen facilities included walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges capable of preparing meals for 5,000 men. The menu featured fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread in quantities that German civilians hadn't seen since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, documented throwing away more food daily than his family had seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, but simple excess required by American regulations to ensure full prisoner rations. This transformation from mockery to amazement represented more than personal revelation. It marked the beginning of ideological collapse among soldiers who had believed themselves warriors for a superior civilization, only to discover they had been tools of a system that couldn't match their captors' abundance, efficiency, or humanity. The systematic exposure to American industrial might was only beginning. What these prisoners would witness in the coming months would complete their psychological transformation from Nazi believers to advocates of democracy, forever changing their understanding of which nation truly represented the future. By September 1943, labor shortages in American agriculture led to the employment of prisoners in fields and factories across the country. This decision, driven by necessity rather than propaganda, would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any re-education program could have achieved. Groups of prisoners were trucked daily to work sites, traveling through the American heartland without blindfolds or restricted routes. They witnessed everything. According to records from the War Relocation Authority, over 40,000 German prisoners would eventually participate in these labor programs. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unteroffizier Herbert Lang documented watching a single machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire Bavarian village could have handled in a month using traditional methods. The gin operated on electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. Contemporary accounts reveal the profound psychological impact of witnessing ordinary American prosperity. The farmer who owned the gin represented no special privilege in Nazi terms, not aristocracy, not a party member, simply a farmer. Yet he possessed electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including African Americans whom Nazi racial theory deemed inferior, ate lunch from boxes containing more food than German workers received in a week. As Lang noted in his diary, this abundance was normal, repeated at every farm they passed. Military historians document that agricultural mechanization provided another devastating blow to German assumptions about American capability. In Nebraska sugar beet fields, prisoners witnessed combine harvesters that could perform the work of 100 men. The fields stretched to the horizon, each larger than entire German counties, producing yields of 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's 30 bushels on the best land. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm outside Scottsbluff, recorded his amazement at observing the farmer's 16-year-old son driving a tractor worth more than everything his father had earned in a lifetime. When Hoffmann mentioned this observation, the boy laughed and explained it wasn't even a particularly good tractor. His father was waiting for a new model from John Deere that would be even better. Geneva Convention rules prohibited direct war production work by prisoners, but they could labor in industries that freed American workers for military production. This technicality allowed thousands of German prisoners to witness American industrial capacity firsthand. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners observed production lines processing more tomatoes in a single day than most German factories handled in a month. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war, documented the experience with precision. Everything operated automatically through electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, and steam cookers that processed hundreds of cans simultaneously. One elderly woman monitored controls that managed what would have required 50 workers in Germany, performing this task while listening to radio and drinking coffee. According to documentation from the Detroit War Production Board, prisoners unloading coal at power plants gained glimpses of automotive industry conversion to war production. The River Rouge complex, visible across the water, employed 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, more than the entire city of Hamburg. Obergefreiter Franz Kellner documented what most stunned the German observers: the worker parking lots containing thousands of automobiles. In Germany, even their officers rarely owned cars. Yet here, factory workers drove to work. When guards explained that many workers owned 2 cars, one for work and one for family use, prisoners initially dismissed this as mockery. The mathematical impossibility seemed designed to demoralize them. By winter 1943, American intelligence officers documented what they termed ideological collapse syndrome among the prisoners. The Special Projects Division, operating under the Provost Marshal General's office, reported increasing numbers of prisoners requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Noland noted in December 1943 that prisoners no longer argued when shown production statistics. They had observed too much contradictory evidence. Contemporary records indicate that camp newspapers produced by prisoners themselves began reflecting this transformation. De Roof, published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually shifted from defiant nationalism to discussions of democracy, economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. The editors, carefully selected anti-Nazi prisoners, found their audience increasingly receptive to such content. The treatment of Italian prisoners after Italy's surrender in September 1943 provided another devastating blow to Nazi racial ideology. Italian prisoners who agreed to cooperate were formed into Italian service units, given better quarters, increased pay, and more freedom. German prisoners watched their former allies working alongside Americans, eating in American restaurants, some even dating American women. Hauptmann Friedrich Schulz documented this psychological warfare in his diary. The Italians had betrayed Germany, yet they received better treatment than Germans had provided them as allies. They worked freely, earned money, sent packages home. The Americans showed no hatred toward those who had fought against them. This democracy that Nazi propaganda depicted as weak appeared more honorable than their own system. Christmas 1943 provided perhaps the most profound psychological impact documented in prisoner records. American organizations, churches, and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners, enemies who had been trying to kill American soldiers months earlier. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. Local communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinners, though regulations prevented most from accepting. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the local Methodist church choir performed Christmas carols in German for the prisoners. Women from Hearn sent homemade cookies and cakes. Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards. This kindness toward enemies shattered the final remnants of Nazi racial theory for many prisoners. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the Hamburg bombing, documented his confusion at this treatment. Americans knew they were enemies. Many had sons and husbands fighting against German armies, yet they demonstrated Christian charity that seemed genuine rather than propagandistic. What kind of people treated enemies with such dignity? Only those absolutely certain of victory and secure in their power. The Christmas feast itself defied comprehension according to multiple prisoner accounts. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice cream, quantities of food that Germany hadn't seen since before the First World War. Prisoners ate until they became sick, unable to comprehend such resources being lavished on enemies. By early 1944, over 25,000 prisoners were enrolled in educational programs according to War Department records. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and sciences. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses. Stanford University sent professors to lecture on democracy and economics. The thirst for knowledge proved insatiable among men who had been told Americans were cultureless barbarians. Hauptmann Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later documented that American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught without hatred. They spoke of science as universal, belonging to all humanity. They demonstrated research years ahead of German capabilities, yet shared knowledge freely with enemies. Camp theaters showed American films, not propaganda, but regular Hollywood productions. Prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, witnessing depictions of American defeat and recovery that resonated with their own situation. They observed The Grapes of Wrath, amazed that Americans would display such self-criticism to enemies. Lieutenant Joseph Kramer noted that Germans hid nothing from their captives. They showed problems, failures, and conflicts openly. Yet this honesty made them stronger rather than weaker. In Germany, such criticism would mean death. Here it was considered patriotic discourse. Spring 1944 brought expanded prisoner labor programs as American production reached peak capacity. German prisoners worked in canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, witnessing the full scope of American industrial might. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners unloaded steel that would become landing craft for D-Day operations. They observed workers assembling 700 boats per month, each requiring 20,000 parts manufactured by subcontractors across the nation. The facility employed 20,000 workers, including thousands of women who operated cranes, welded hulls, and managed production lines. Everything Nazi ideology claimed was impossible in a democracy. Women performing men's work, diverse populations cooperating effectively, maximum production achieved through voluntary effort rather than coercion. Stabsfeld-Weibel Kurt Zimmermann documented watching this systematic destruction of his worldview. Women performed technical work that German doctrine reserved for men. African Americans operated complex machinery that Nazi racial theory claimed they couldn't understand. Teenagers ran drilling equipment with precision that exceeded German industrial standards. Yet production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days per week. They produced more boats in 1 month than the German Navy had built in an entire year. The mathematical impossibility of American industrial capacity was becoming undeniable reality. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed production of 10,000 tons of steel daily. The blast furnaces ran continuously, fed by endless trains carrying iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. This single plant produced more steel than the entire Ruhr Valley at its peak output. Obergefreiter Paul Hartmann, who had worked at Krupp before the war, thought he understood industrial production. But American scale transcended his comprehension. They wasted more steel in spillage than Germany could produce through maximum effort. Workers complained about overtime while achieving production quantities that German facilities couldn't match using slave labor and double shifts. The summer 1944 harvest provided final demolition of Nazi propaganda about American agricultural weakness. German prisoners worked across the Midwest, witnessing production that could feed the world. In Kansas, they watched wheat harvests, where single farms produced more grain than entire German provinces. Combines moved across fields like ships across an ocean of gold, each harvesting 100 acres per day. The grain elevators they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported annually. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, calculated that one American farmer with machinery accomplished the work of 100 German farmers using traditional methods. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards, stretching beyond the horizon. They watched perfectly good fruit discarded for minor blemishes, fruit that would have been treasured in Germany. Entire crops were sometimes ploughed under to maintain prices, a concept that caused psychological breakdown among prisoners from hunger-ravaged Germany. Gefreiter Otto Schulz documented Americans destroying food to keep prices stable. Mountains of oranges bulldozed into pits because they possessed too many. Prisoners begged to send surplus to their families in Germany, but guards explained this was impossible. The waste represented strategic proof of unlimited resources rather than callous indifference. The cumulative psychological impact was creating what intelligence officers termed complete ideological reversal. These hardened Wehrmacht veterans were becoming advocates for democracy and capitalism, having witnessed firsthand the prosperity these systems generated. They understood now that everything they had been told about American weakness was propaganda designed to justify a war Germany could never win. The transformation was so complete that American authorities worried about prisoners becoming too enthusiastic about American methods. Some requested permission to remain after the war. Others married American women through prison correspondence programs. Thousands would eventually immigrate to America in the 1950s, carrying with them intimate knowledge of what free societies could achieve when properly organized. Their journey from Nazi warriors to democratic converts was approaching its climax, but the most devastating revelations still lay ahead. June 6, 1944. When news of the Normandy invasion reached German prisoner camps across America, the psychological transformation that had been building for months reached its breaking point. According to records from the office of the Provost Marshal General, prisoners at Camp Shelby gathered around radios, listening to reports of the largest amphibious operation in military history. The scale defied comprehension, even for men who had witnessed American abundance firsthand. Military historians note that intercepted radio traffic revealed the staggering logistics behind Operation Overlord. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men in the first wave alone. German prisoners who had spent months observing American industrial capacity finally understood the mathematical inevitability of their homeland's defeat. Obergefreiter Friedrich von Tauben documented the moment of realization in his diary, writing that they now knew everything was lost, not just the war, but the entire Nazi project that had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with racial mythology rather than material resources. The artificial harbours constructed for the invasion particularly astounded German engineering personnel among the prisoners. According to contemporary documentation, these mulberry harbours delivered 15,000 tons of supplies daily across open beaches, more than major European ports handled under peacetime conditions. German military doctrine had assumed such operations were physically impossible, yet American engineering had made the impossible routine. Contemporary accounts describe how German prisoners experienced something that challenged Nazi ideology more profoundly than any material demonstration: American humanity toward enemies. Despite propaganda depicting Americans as weak and sentimental, prisoners discovered a people secure enough in their strength to demonstrate mercy consistently. When Gefreiter Hans Müller's son died in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered genuine condolences. Documentation from various camps reveals systematic examples of this unexpected humanity. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote that she struggled to feed their children, American church groups sent food packages directly to Germany. To enemy civilians in a nation, America was actively bombing. They separated the German people from the Nazi regime, wrote Hauptmann Otto Weber in his diary. They insisted they fought Hitler, not Germans. This distinction, which initially seemed like propaganda, proved authentic through consistent actions. Medical treatment particularly affected prisoners according to multiple documented accounts. German doctors worked alongside American medical staff, learning new techniques and using advanced equipment. Prisoners received operations that would have been available only to Nazi party elite in Germany. Mental health treatment, virtually unknown in the Wehrmacht, was provided to traumatized soldiers through counseling rather than punishment. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, the chief surgeon captured with the 164th Light Division, documented treating attempted suicides with therapy rather than court-martial. Prisoners experiencing mental breakdowns received professional care rather than beatings. This systematic humanity toward enemies revealed a confidence that German military psychology had never understood, the strength that comes from secure power rather than desperate brutality. By March 1945, records indicate that secret re-education programs had produced remarkable results beyond American expectations. Over 25,000 prisoners had volunteered for democracy courses without coercion. Camp newspapers published articles about constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Discussion groups debated Germany's post-war future with enthusiasm that surprised American observers. The program's success exceeded all projections according to War Department assessments. Prisoners who had arrived as fanatical Nazis were writing essays about democratic reconstruction. Officers who had sworn personal oaths to Hitler were planning how to implement American agricultural methods in post-war Germany. Oberst Hermann Göring, no relation to the Reichsmarschall, admitted in a 1975 interview that they became missionaries for democracy through observation rather than indoctrination. The transformation proved so complete that American authorities worried about prisoners becoming overly enthusiastic about American methods. Some prisoners requested permission to remain permanently in America after the war. Others married American women they met through prison correspondence programs. Thousands would eventually immigrate to America during the 1950s, carrying intimate knowledge of what democratic societies could achieve. April 1945 brought the final revelation that completed the psychological destruction of Nazi ideology. As American forces liberated concentration camps throughout Germany, footage was shown to German prisoners in America. Many initially refused to believe the evidence, dismissing it as propaganda, but testimony from American soldiers, photographs, newsreels, and eventually letters from Germany confirmed the horrific reality. According to documentation from camp psychological services, the impact was devastating for men who had maintained some vestige of pride in German honor despite military defeat. They now faced complete moral collapse of everything they had fought to defend. Hauptmann Walter Schmidt wrote what many considered the most eloquent summary of their transformation. They had believed themselves warriors for a great cause, only to discover they were tools of criminals. They had thought they brought civilization to inferior peoples, but found themselves to be the barbarians. The Americans they had called weak and decadent had shown them what civilization actually meant. Contemporary records describe the complex emotions prisoners experienced facing repatriation between 1945 and 1946. They had witnessed an America that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught them. They had eaten better as prisoners than as soldiers, been treated with more dignity by enemies than by their own government. The final months were spent preparing for return to a destroyed Germany through American vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction. According to historical documentation, prisoners learned about the Marshall Plan before its official announcement, understanding that America intended to rebuild rather than punish Germany. They prepared us to rebuild our country, wrote Oberst Friedrich von Tauben. They provided skills, knowledge, and hope. They transformed defeated soldiers into future citizens. This generosity from victors was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi vindictiveness and theories of racial struggle. Between 1945 and 1946, military records indicate that 371,683 German prisoners were repatriated from American camps to a Germany that was divided, destroyed, and destitute. But they carried something invaluable: knowledge of how democratic, industrial societies functioned effectively. The German prisoners who had experienced American prosperity became unwitting agents of transformation in post-war Germany. Many former prisoners rose to prominence in West Germany's reconstruction, according to post-war biographical research. Hans Kroll, who had been held at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes at Camp Como, served as president of the European Commission. Rudiger von Weschmar, imprisoned at Camp Herne, became German permanent representative to the United Nations. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, and American democratic ideals to German politics. Historians have noted that the economic miracle transforming West Germany in the 1950s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps. Former prisoners understood that prosperity came from freedom rather than conquest, that democracy created wealth rather than destroying it, that treating workers well increased production rather than weakening discipline. These lessons, learned through observation rather than instruction, shaped the new Germany's fundamental approach to governance and economics. The success of German prisoner re-education in America has been called one of history's most effective conversion programs by multiple historians. Without coercion or traditional propaganda, American industrial might and democratic values converted hardened Nazis into future democratic citizens. The program succeeded because it relied on demonstration rather than rhetoric. Prisoners observed American society functioning at peak efficiency while treating enemies with systematic dignity. Dr. Arnold Kramer, the leading historian of German prisoners in America, concluded that America won the ideological war not through clever messages, but through undeniable reality. Every full meal, every electric light, every functioning toilet became an argument against Nazism more powerful than any speech. The prisoners were converted by prosperity rather than persuaded by propaganda. Statistical analysis supports this assessment according to multiple scholarly sources. Of the 371,683 German prisoners held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape, with only 2,222 total escape attempts recorded. Post-war surveys showed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war, creating personal bonds that transcended former enmity. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, surviving German prisoners held a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former prisoners returned to America, many bringing their families to show them where their transformation had begun. Former Obergefreiter Hans Weber, who had been held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later returned to become a physician in Georgetown, Maine, spoke at the reunion about discovering running water, central heating, and abundant food, but more importantly, discovering human dignity. Former Stabsfeld-Weibel Kurt Meyer, who had worked on Iowa farms, added that American farmers treated them not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared meals, knowledge, and sometimes their homes with people whose sons were fighting German armies. This humanity from those who had every reason for hatred changed the prisoners forever, creating bonds that lasted decades beyond the war's end. At the reunion dinner, former Oberst Hermann Göring, then 78 years old, delivered a keynote address that captured the essence of their transformation. They had arrived in America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in racial superiority and national conquest. They departed as friends, as Democrats, as men who had witnessed the truth about what free societies could achieve through cooperation rather than coercion. According to his recorded speech, They had observed the arsenal of democracy at full production, farmers who fed the world, workers who built tools of victory, and citizens who treated enemies with dignity they had never experienced. They learned that America's true weapon was not bombs or tanks, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and unshakable confidence in democratic values. The audience erupted in standing ovation, according to contemporary accounts. Americans and Germans together, former enemies united in recognition of a transformation that had seemed impossible when those first trains rolled into Texas in June 1943. The magnitude of change was measured not just in individual conversions, but in the broader impact on German society and European reconstruction. The demographic composition of this transformation deserves particular attention according to recent historical analysis. These were not marginal figures, but often the Wehrmacht's most experienced soldiers, Afrika Korps veterans, seasoned NCOs, junior officers, who would return to positions of influence in post-war German society. Their systematic conversion to democratic values provided West Germany with a cadre of leaders who understood through personal experience what free societies could accomplish. Contemporary documentation reveals that many former prisoners became advocates for the Atlantic Alliance, supporters of NATO membership, and champions of European integration. They had seen America not as a foreign power to be resisted, but as a model to be emulated. Their influence extended through German political parties, labor unions, business associations, and cultural institutions throughout the Reconstruction period. The ripple effects extended beyond Germany itself, according to international relations scholars. Former prisoners who became diplomats, businessmen, and political leaders carried pro-American attitudes throughout Europe during the crucial early years of the Cold War. They served as living testimony that American power, when properly exercised, created prosperity rather than oppression, freedom rather than subjugation. This transformation represents one of history's most remarkable examples of soft power achieving strategic objectives through demonstration rather than coercion. The German prisoners who witnessed American industrial might become unwitting ambassadors of democratic capitalism, carrying the seeds of transformation back to societies that would become America's most reliable allies in the decades that followed. The story continues to resonate in contemporary discussions of conflict resolution and post-war reconstruction, offering lessons about the power of dignity, abundance, and democratic values to transform even the most committed adversaries into lasting friends and partners. And the transformation of 371,683 German prisoners from Nazi believers to democratic advocates stands as testament to a profound truth about warfare in the modern age. According to multiple historical assessments, America's greatest victory was achieved not through superior tactics or overwhelming firepower, but through the simple demonstration of what free societies could accomplish when their industrial capacity was fully mobilized. These prisoners had arrived expecting to find the weak, divided nation described in Nazi propaganda. Instead, they discovered a civilization that produced more in abundance than their homeland could manage through coercion. They witnessed farmers who fed continents, workers who built the tools of victory, and citizens who treated enemies with dignity that challenged every assumption about democratic weakness. The mathematical reality was inescapable according to production records from the period. American factories built more aircraft in 1944 than Japan produced throughout the entire war. Single plants outproduced entire German industrial regions. Individual farms exceeded the agricultural output of German provinces. This wasn't military superiority, it was civilizational abundance that rendered Nazi ideology obsolete through sheer demonstration. Perhaps most remarkably, historical documentation reveals that this transformation occurred without coercion or traditional propaganda. These hardened Wehrmacht veterans converted to democratic values because they observed prosperity, efficiency, and humanity operating on scales their previous experience couldn't have imagined. They returned to Germany as unwitting missionaries, for the very system they had been sent to destroy. The legacy extends far beyond individual conversions, according to post-war analysis. Many former prisoners became architects of West Germany's reconstruction, bringing American methods to German industry and democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built partly on foundations laid in American prison camps, where enemy soldiers learned that prosperity flowed from freedom rather than conquest. This story reminds us that the most powerful weapons in any nation's arsenal may not be military at all, but the capacity to create abundance, demonstrate dignity, and prove through example that free societies offer humanity's best hope for prosperity and peace. The German prisoners who witnessed America's industrial might returned home not as defeated enemies, but as witnesses to what democratic civilization could achieve. What lessons do you think this remarkable transformation holds for understanding how societies can overcome ideological divisions? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this hidden story as compelling as I did,